Cash and Edward had always been a man who controlled everything: his business, his emotions, and his life. Today was no different. His wedding day was planned down to the last second. Every guest in attendance was either powerful or influential, the kind of people who didn't just witness events but dictated them. And at the center of it all was him, billionaire, CEO, the man everyone either feared or admired. And then there was Delphine, his fiancée, soon to be his wife. She was the perfect choice, beautiful, elegant, and well-bred. The daughter of a senator, the kind of woman who belonged by his side in every way. Their engagement had been a business arrangement first, but Cashin had convinced himself that it could be more, that maybe, in time, love would follow. But love had never been part of the deal. Not for her. The realization struck him the moment he opened the door to his private dressing room. He hadn't expected much, just a few quiet minutes to compose himself before the ceremony. But the second he stepped inside, he saw them. Delphine, Lucien, entangled. His best man had her pressed against the vanity, her pure white gown hiked up, her arms wrapped around his neck like she had forgotten she was supposed to be marrying someone else in less than 20 minutes. Lucien, his best man, standing between her legs, his hands gripping her waist. Their mouths met in a fevered kiss, bodies tangled in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Cashin didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. His heart didn't lurch. His chest didn't ache. That would have required shock, pain. But this was something else entirely. Something colder. For the first time in his life, he felt nothing. Not shock, not pain, just a quiet, simmering rage that settled deep in his chest. Delphine pulled away first, laughing under her breath. "You're insatiable," she murmured, her fingers toying with Lucien's tie. Lucien smirked, his voice just as low. "It's not my fault you look this good. We need to be careful. Cashin is—" Her words died the moment she spotted him. Her face drained of color so fast, it was almost amusing. Lucien stiffened, his grip on her tightening before he slowly turned his head, meeting Cashin's glare with wide, startled eyes. For a brief, ridiculous second, no one moved. Then Delphine shoved Lucien away, adjusting her dress as if that could erase what Cashin had just seen. "Cashin, this isn't— Think very carefully about what you say next." His voice was quiet, controlled. That was the only warning he gave her. Her lips parted, then closed again. Whatever excuse she'd been about to spit out, she realized it wasn't going to work. Lucien, ever the arrogant bastard, exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "Cashin, listen. It was— Don't—" That single word cut through the air like a blade. Lucien had the sense to shut up. Cashin's eyes drifted between them, taking in every detail. The way Delphine's hands trembled slightly, the way Lucien shifted as if preparing for a fight. The sheer stupidity of it all. He could crush them both. Right here, right now. But that would be too easy. A slow exhale left his lips. He glanced between them. There was a time he might have confronted them, demanded an explanation. That time had passed. "Fix your dress," he said flatly, his voice disturbingly calm. Delphine blinked, clearly confused. Lucien swallowed hard. "Man, listen. Did I say you could speak?" Cashin cut in, his tone so cold that Lucien immediately shut his mouth. His eyes shifted back to Delphine. "Fix your dress." Her fingers trembled as she smoothed the fabric down, her pale cheeks darkening with humiliation. "Cashin, please, save it." He adjusted his cufflinks, barely sparing them another glance. "The ceremony starts in 15 minutes. You'll walk down that aisle. You'll smile for the cameras. And then I'll ruin you both." Lucien flinched. "You don't mean that?" Cashin finally looked at him, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Don't I?" Neither of them moved as he walked past them, stepping out of the room and shutting the door behind him. The moment he was alone, something inside him shifted. The betrayal should have hurt. It didn't. He had never loved Delphine. Maybe that was why this didn't break him. But that didn't mean he would let it slide. They had humiliated him, made a fool out of him on the most public day of his life. They thought they had won. No, they hadn't even begun to understand what it meant to cross him. They would. Cashin stepped into the main hallway, nodding at one of the event coordinators who rushed to his side. "Everything is in place, Mr. Edward," she chirped, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. "We'll start seating the guests now." "Good," he replied, his mind already working. Revenge had always been something he executed ruthlessly. But today, fate handed him something even better. The ceremony was minutes from starting. The guests, high-profile figures, business tycoons, celebrities, chatted amongst themselves, sipping champagne, unaware that the wedding was already in ruins. Cashin stood near the altar, his mind razor-sharp despite the storm raging inside him. Every calculated decision he'd made in life had led him to this moment. And now everything had shifted. Delphine entered, radiant as ever in her white gown, her hand clutching a bouquet. No one would suspect that minutes ago, those same hands had been wrapped around another man. A waitress moved through the aisle, balancing a silver tray of drinks. Cashin barely noticed her, until a sudden jolt sent a full glass of cranberry juice flying straight into Delphine's chest. The deep red spread across the pristine fabric like spilled blood. The waitress stood frozen in place, eyes wide with horror, an empty glass in her trembling hands. Delphine sat opposite her, her once white wedding gown now stained with deep red splashes of cranberry juice. A sharp gasp cut through the room. The bride froze, staring down in horror. The waitress, petite, dark curls falling from her pinned-up hair, looked equally stunned. Cashin was still too mesmerized to take his eyes off her. She looked like she had fallen straight from heaven. He had never seen anything like her. Her hands trembled as she took a step back. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." The apology never had a chance. Delphine let out a furious shriek. "You idiot! Do you have any idea how much this dress costs?" The guests fell into hushed murmurs, eyes darting between the bride and the trembling waitress. Cashin, however, was not watching Delphine. His gaze was locked on the woman who had unknowingly given him the perfect moment. The beautiful brown-skinned waitress, Mirella Cruz. She looked mortified, her brown eyes wide as she clutched the empty tray to her chest. This wasn't her world. She didn't belong among billionaires and high society. And yet, for some reason, Cashin couldn't look away. Delphine, still fuming, turned to her maid of honor. "Get me out of here," she hissed before storming off to clean the stain. Cashin watched her leave, then pulled out his phone. With a few swipes, he opened his gallery. The picture, Delphine and Lucien, caught in their betrayal. Another tap, and the images were sent to everyone in attendance. Seconds later, a ripple of reaction swept through the crowd as phones lit up with notifications. Gasps, whispers, the clicking of cameras. Delphine's picture-perfect wedding was crumbling in real time. Cashin slid his phone back into his pocket. Then, with a quick step, he walked up to Mirella where she stood, still stuck to the ground. She stiffened as he neared, clutching the tray like a shield. "I really am sorry," she whispered. "It was an accident. Please don't fire me." Cashin's voice was quiet, but firm. "Marry me instead." Mirella blinked. "What?" The guests were still murmuring, Delphine nowhere in sight. Cashin met Mirella's eyes, unwavering. "Be my wife." She let out a shaky breath. "You're joking." He wasn't. Mirella's heart pounded against her ribs. This was crazy. Insane. She had a son to think about. Rent that was overdue. A life that had been nothing but struggle since the day she became a single mother. Since her ex-husband walked out of her life, leaving her with a baby. Cashin didn't know this, but it wasn't lying if she didn't say anything from the start. Cashin Edward was offering her something she never thought possible. A way out. Her hands trembled as she looked into his unreadable expression. For her son. For their future. She swallowed hard. "Okay." Cashin took her hand, turned back to the altar, and without a single glance toward the doors Delphine had disappeared through, he led Mirella to the wedding of a lifetime. Cashin Edward didn't believe in half measures. If he was going to do something, he would do it completely, mercilessly. And today, he had every intention of ensuring that Delphine and Lucien felt the full force of his wrath. The first order of business was Mirella. She had agreed to marry him, but that wasn't enough. If she was going to be his wife, at least in public, then she needed to look the part. This wasn't about vanity or appearances. It was about power, about control, about showing the world that Cash and Edward did not lose. So, with a single command, he had his assistant arrange everything. Hair, makeup, the finest gown money could buy, all within the next hour. Morella stood stiffly as the team of stylists swarmed around her, eyes darting toward him like she still wasn't sure if this was some elaborate joke. He wasn't amused. Hold still, he instructed as the lead stylist adjusted a diamond necklace around her throat. You're my wife now. Act like it. Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't argue. Instead, she clenched her fingers together as they transformed her before his eyes. The tired waitress in a simple uniform was gone. In her place stood a woman who looked like she belonged in his world. A masterpiece in silk and diamonds. Cashin let his eyes drag over her. Good? Morella shifted, clearly uncomfortable. You're enjoying this, aren't you? His lips curled. More than you know. She didn't realize what was coming next. But Lucien and Delphine did. As they stepped back into the grand hall, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones buzzed, whispers spread like wildfire. The scandal had already begun unraveling before anyone had even seen Cashin's bride. And then they saw her, Morella Cruz, now Morella Edward, at his side, dressed in a gown that probably cost more than Delphine's entire bridal wardrobe. A picture of elegance, her dark curls cascading over one shoulder, her lips painted a deep shade of red. The contrast between her and Delphine, whose wedding gown was still ruined with splashes of cranberry, was impossible to ignore. Cashin caught the exact moment Delphine saw them. Her expression twisted from disbelief to sheer rage in seconds. Lucien, standing just behind her, looked equally stunned. His eyes moved to Cashin, then to Morella, and finally to the dozens of guests now staring at them. Cashin could almost hear the thoughts racing through his former best friend's head. The realization that he was ruined, that Delphine was ruined, that neither of them had the upper hand anymore. The humiliation was instant. Delphine's fingers curled around the edge of her stained dress, her lips trembling with barely contained fury. You? Cashin tilted his head, feigning curiosity. Problem? She inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, but before she could speak, a journalist's voice cut through the tension. Mr. Edward, is it true that you just married Miss Morella Cruz? More flashes. More whispers. Cashin let a slow smile spread across his face as he turned to the reporters. That's Mrs. Edward now, he corrected smoothly, pulling Morella closer to his side. She stiffened, but didn't resist. Another journalist pushed forward. But what about Miss Delphine Laurent? Wasn't she supposed to be your bride today? Cashin's blue eyes shifted back to Delphine. Oh, I suppose that was the plan. He let the word settle before adding. But plans change. A murmur of laughter rolled through the guests. Delphine's eyes widened, her face burning red. You set this up? Cashin's expression remained indifferent. You did that yourself. Her jaw clenched, and she spun to Lucien, like he would somehow salvage the situation. But Lucien looked just as lost. He had always been the kind of man who thrived when things were in his favor. But under scrutiny, under humiliation, he crumbled. Cashin. Lucien started, be reasonable. Reasonable? Cashin echoed. Was I supposed to be reasonable when I walked in on you and my fiancée? Was I supposed to be reasonable when you were whispering in corners, laughing behind my back? Tell me, Lucien, how would you have handled this? Lucien's throat bobbed. He had no answer. More cameras clicked. The guests were eating this up. This wasn't just another scandal. This was a public execution. And Cashin wasn't finished. His assistant stepped forward, handing him a black envelope. He took it without looking and extended it toward Delphine. For you? She eyed it warily. What is this? Your severance package? Confusion spread across her face before she tore open the envelope. Whatever she saw inside made her lips part in horror. Her eyes snapped to his. You wouldn't. I already did. The documents inside weren't just evidence of her affair with Lucien. They were financial records, proof that she had been siphoning money from Cashin's companies for years. If this went public, her father's career would be finished. Her family's name would be dragged through the mud. Cashin, she whispered, a plea now laced in her voice. Please. But he wasn't listening. He turned away, guiding Morella with him. Enjoy the reception, he said over his shoulder. I'm sure you'll find it eventful. Delphine's strangled gasp was the last thing he heard before stepping away. Morella, still gripping his arm, exhaled shakily. That was brutal. Cashin glanced down at her. That was only the beginning. She didn't ask what he meant. Maybe she didn't want to know. But Cashin knew one thing for certain. Delphine and Lucien's humiliation today was just the opening act. The real show was still to come. Morella had expected resentment, coldness, maybe even hostility. But she hadn't expected tenderness. The wedding had been a spectacle, a carefully orchestrated show for the world to see. At the reception, Cashin played the role of the devoted husband flawlessly. His arm remained around her waist, his deep voice laced with a warmth she hadn't expected. He whispered against her ear when no one was looking, feeding her compliments that sent an unfamiliar heat rushing through her. He made her feel like she belonged. But even as she smiled, Morella reminded herself it was all for show. Yet, as the days passed, Cashin's behavior didn't change. He didn't cast her aside. He didn't ignore her like she had feared. Instead, he treated her like a wife. She woke up to breakfast laid out for her, freshly cut flowers in a vase by her bedside. He spoke to her with genuine curiosity, asking about her day, her thoughts, her past. He was patient, attentive, and when they attended events together, he made sure she never felt out of place. She could feel herself slipping, falling. It would have been easy to believe he was falling too, but she couldn't afford to, because there was something she hadn't told him. And every day that passed, the guilt gnawed at her. Cashin leaned against the doorway of his office, watching Morella from across the hall. She was seated in the garden, bathed in golden sunlight, absent-mindedly stirring her tea. She was breathtaking. The way the wind played with her hair, the way her lips pursed in thought, everything about her made it harder for him to remember why he had married her in the first place. It had been revenge, a way to humiliate Delphine, a way to prove a point, or that was just his silly excuse to wife this angel up. And now, he couldn't deny the truth anymore. He had never wanted anyone like this. She had captured his heart that wanted love, but couldn't find it in anyone else. He wanted Morella, not as a pawn, not as a means to an end, as his wife. And yet, something was off. She had been slipping away from him. He had noticed it in the little things. The way she checked her phone when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she hesitated before answering certain questions, the way she sometimes disappeared for hours at a time. She was hiding something, and tonight he was going to find out what. Morella checked her watch, her pulse quickening. It was late, too late. She had waited until she was sure Cashin was asleep before slipping out of the mansion. It had become a routine, sneaking away under the cover of darkness, hailing a cab to the small apartment on the other side of the city. To see him, her son. Matteo's little arms wrapped around her the second she stepped inside, his sleepy voice murmuring against her shoulder. "Mommy, I'm here, baby," she whispered, holding him tightly. Her best friend, Camila, gave her a knowing look. "You can't keep doing this, Morella. If Cashin finds out, he won't." Morella brushed a hand through Matteo's hair, guilt tightening around her chest like a noose. I can't tell him. Not yet." She knew Cashin wasn't a cruel man. If anything, he had been nothing but kind to her. But this was different. He had married her without knowing the full truth. And if he found out she had kept something this big from him, she wasn't sure if he would ever forgive her. Cashin gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight as he stared at the small apartment building. Morella had left the mansion an hour ago. Alone. She had thought he was asleep. She had been wrong. His gut had told him something wasn't right, and now here he was, parked outside, watching the building where his wife had disappeared. Minutes passed, and then he saw her. Morella stepped out of the building, adjusting her coat, looking around cautiously before hurrying toward the street to hail a cab. But it wasn't just her. A little boy trailed behind her, rubbing his sleepy eyes, his tiny hand grasping hers. Cashin's stomach dropped. He confirmed everything he had been hearing. His mind blanked, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly, utterly heartbroken. Not because she had a child, but because she had hidden the truth away from him. He drove home, leaving her on that sidewalk. Morella had grown used to the kindness. The way Cashin's arms would always pull her close the moment she stepped through the door. The quiet, affectionate greetings that had become their routine. The way he would kiss the top of her head, fingers lingering on the small of her back, making her feel cherished, wanted. But tonight was different. The moment she walked into the house, she knew. Cashin was there, standing near the staircase in his usual crisp shirt with the sleeves pushed up, a glass of whiskey resting in his hand. His stare lifted when she entered, but there was no warmth in it, no softening of his sharp features. Just silence, heavy and cold. Morella hesitated in the doorway, shifting the strap of her purse over her shoulder. "I'm home," she said lightly, waiting for the usual response. Nothing. Cashin took a slow sip of his drink. "I see that." That was it. No smile, no embrace. Just 3 words, cool and distant. Morella frowned. "Is something wrong?" His expression didn't change. "I have work to do." With that, he turned and walked away, his steps unhurried as he disappeared down the hallway. No kiss, no conversation, just an icy wall between them. She exhaled slowly, gripping the strap of her purse. So this is how it happens. She had been foolish to believe things would stay perfect, that the man who had treated her like she mattered would continue doing so. It was too good to be true. She didn't sleep that night. Cashin had never slept in a different room before. No matter how late he worked, he would always find his way into their bed. But tonight his absence stretched through the darkness, and Morella lay awake, staring at the empty space beside her. Her fingers curled into the sheets. Why won't he just tell me what's wrong? The next morning, she tried again. She found him in the dining room, sipping black coffee while scrolling through his phone. His posture was relaxed, but his expression was unreadable. Morella pulled out a chair across from him. "Cashin." He glanced at her briefly, then returned to his phone. Frustration bubbled in her chest. "Can you at least tell me what's going on?" "I'm busy." Her nails dug into her palm. "Cashin." The scrape of his chair against the floor cut her off. He stood, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, and looked down at her. "If you have something to do today, you should go." That was all he said before walking away. Morella watched him leave, a sick feeling curling in her stomach. Whatever this was, whatever had caused the shift between them, it wasn't small, and he wasn't going to tell her. Cashin knew she was hurting. He saw it in the way her eyes followed him when he avoided her touch. Heard it in the way her voice grew smaller each time he dismissed her questions. A part of him wanted to tell her the truth, to ask her why she had lied, why she had hidden something so important from him, but he couldn't. He decided to take a walk in the park one night, and as he sat on one of the benches, a little boy walked up to him with fearless eyes, hands stuffed in his pockets like he owned the world. He recognized the little boy, Morella's son. "You look like you don't like people very much." Cashin had blinked at the child's bluntness. "Excuse me?" The boy shrugged. "You just have that face. My mom says some people like to be alone, but I don't believe that. I think people just pretend." Cashin found himself staring. He didn't know why, but something about the kid felt familiar. He reminded him of himself when he was that age. He had smirked, crouching slightly. "And what do you think I'm pretending about?" The boy tilted his head, studying him. "You look sad." Cashin hadn't expected that. Before he could respond, the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, slightly crumpled piece of candy. He held it out. "Here, it makes me feel better when I'm sad." Cashin had hesitated before accepting it, something strange tightening in his chest. Then he heard it, a voice calling the boy's name. A name he recognized, Morella's voice. The boy had turned at the sound, waving toward the distance. "That's my mom." Cashin's breath had stalled, and as the child ran off, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, Cashin remained standing there, holding a crumpled piece of candy and realizing he had fallen in love with a liar. Every time he thought about confronting her, he remembered the little boy in the park. He didn't mean to keep seeing the boy, but he found himself returning to the park, sitting on the same bench, watching as the child played, his laughter filling the air. And before he even realized what he was doing, Cashin had started bringing gifts. Small things at first. A toy car left on the park bench, a book carefully placed near the playground. Things the boy would find and smile about. It was stupid, completely irrational. But he couldn't stop. And then one day, Morella appeared. Cashin had been speaking with the boy when he saw her. She stood frozen near the park entrance, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected to see him. Her lips parted. Cashin? The boy turned at the sound of her voice. Mom? Cashin stood slowly, his eyes locking onto hers. And in that moment, all the silence, all the distance, all the coldness between them snapped. He exhaled sharply. Say something. Morella swallowed. I. His voice was low, controlled. How long were you planning to keep this from me? She flinched. It's not like that. Then tell me. He took a step forward. Tell me why you lied. Morella clenched her hands. I didn't know how to. You didn't know how to what, Morella? His tone sharpened. Tell me you have a son? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Cashin let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You let me believe we had something real. And the whole time, you were keeping this from me? Morella's throat tightened. I was scared. Scared? His voice was quiet now. Or just unwilling to trust me? Tears burned in her eyes. Cashin, I should have seen it coming, he said, stepping back. I was a fool to believe you. Morella stared at him, her heart breaking. And just like that, he turned and walked away. The next day, Morella's heart pounded as she stood outside Cashin's office, her son's small hand gripping hers. This was his idea. Her 6-year-old boy had insisted they come here to fix things. She had lost count of how many times she had stood in front of this door over the past few weeks, waiting, hoping. But today, it wasn't just for her. It was for the little boy beside her, who had grown fond of the man she had married. The secretary gave her an uncertain look, but before she could stop them, her son pushed the heavy door open. Cashin sat behind his massive desk, fingers resting on his temple, looking exhausted before the day even began. His presence filled the room effortlessly. But today, there was something different. Distance. Her son walked in with all the confidence of a child who had no idea he was stepping into the office of one of the most powerful men in the country. Mr. Cashin. His voice was bright, warm, so unaware of the tension suffocating the air. Cashin lifted his gaze slowly. His stare locked onto the boy, and something changed in his eyes. Something softer. The little boy didn't wait for an invitation. He marched forward, stopping right in front of Cashin's desk, his small hands pressing against the polished surface. You have to forgive my mommy. Morella held her breath. Cashin leaned back in his chair. And why should I? The little boy frowned. Because she's sorry. Silence. Cashin studied the child. Is that so? The little boy nodded enthusiastically. She told me she wishes you weren't mad anymore. And she made my favorite pancakes this morning because she was sad. Morella's throat burned. She hadn't realized her son had noticed. Cashin exhaled, rubbing his jaw as he stared at the boy. This boy who reminded him of himself when he was younger. Witty. Stubborn. Too smart for his age. Cashin's voice was lower when he spoke again. Only because you asked nicely. The boy grinned, turning to his mother. See? Told you he would. Morella let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Cashin met her gaze for the first time in what felt like forever. His words were cool, but his voice betrayed something deeper. And, because I want to keep seeing him, but they both knew that wasn't entirely true. That evening, Morella cooked his favorite meal. It was a quiet peace offering, an unspoken apology. Cashin didn't say much when he sat down at the dining table, but he ate. She stole glances at him between bites, watching the way his shoulders relaxed and the way the tension in his jaw eased. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. It's good. It wasn't much, but it was something. Over the next few days, things slowly returned to normal, or something close to it. The tension in the air wasn't as thick. He no longer avoided her completely. There were moments, small ones, where his guard slipped, where his fingers brushed hers when reaching for a glass, where she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She let herself hope. Then one day, everything shattered. Morella never imagined she'd find herself in a high-end boutique, trying on designer clothes. Cashin had handed her his black card that morning, his voice as blunt as ever. Your clothes are getting too old. She wanted to argue, to snap back that she didn't need his money, But the truth was, she did need new clothes. And a part of her, the part that still wanted to believe in this marriage, felt warm at the thought of him caring enough to notice. So here she was, stepping out of the fitting room in a sleek red dress that hugged her nice curves. It was beautiful. And then a voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking. Well, if it isn't Mrs. Edward. Morella froze. She turned slowly, her eyes landing on Delphine. The woman stood a few feet away, dressed in an outfit that screamed luxury, her lips curled in amusement. Enjoying spending Cashin's money? Morella forced herself to remain calm. She wouldn't give Delphine the satisfaction of a reaction. What do you want? Delphine pulled out her phone, tapping the screen with a smirk. I thought you'd like to hear what your loving husband said about you. The voice that played through the speaker made Morella's heart stop. It was Cashin's voice, dripping with ice. I don't love her. She's just a waitress. Marrying her was just for reputation. Nothing more. I just wanted to be nice. That's why I've been kind to her. You know business? A male voice chuckled in the background. So you really threw a billionaire's wedding just to humiliate Delphine? Cashin laughed. She deserved it. And the waitress? Just collateral damage. Morella couldn't breathe. The boutique, the dress, everything blurred into nothing. Delphine's smile widened as she tucked her phone away. Hurts, doesn't it? To know you were nothing but a joke. Morella swallowed hard, forcing back the sting of tears. She wanted to scream, to deny it, to tell Delphine that Cashin wasn't that cruel, that she was lying. But the recording was dated. A day ago. This wasn't from the past. This wasn't old. This was now. Morella turned without a word, walking straight to the cashier. She bought the dress, not because she wanted it, not because she cared, but because she refused to let Delphine see her crumble. She walked out of the boutique with her head high, but her hands trembled. That night, she packed her bags and prepped her little boy. She was done. Cashin stepped into the house, expecting smiles and hugs, expecting to find Morella and the boy where they always were, where they belonged. Instead, his stomach twisted at the sight in front of him. Morella stood at the door, her son clutching her hand, a suitcase at her feet. His pulse pounded, his mind struggling to catch up. Where are you going? She didn't answer. Not at first. Her fingers curled tighter around the handle of the suitcase, as if holding on to the last piece of herself. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen, and lifted it between them. His own voice spilled from the speakers. Cashin felt the blood drain from his face. The voice continued, sharp and unrelenting. His own laugh followed, cruel and distant. She deserved it. And the waitress? Just collateral damage. Morella's hand trembled as she lowered the phone. Was I ever anything more than a pawn? Cashin swallowed hard. He had never felt this before, this unfamiliar, crushing fear. Not fear of business failures. Not fear of losing money or power. Fear of losing her. Morella, let me explain. She shook her head, her breath uneven. Explain what, Cashin? That I was some joke to you? That you married me to get back at your ex? His jaw clenched. I didn't mean those words. Her laugh was hollow. You didn't mean them? She took a step forward, shoving the phone into his hands. That was recorded yesterday. His fingers curled around the device, his mind racing. Cashin wasn't sure what was worse, the pain in her voice or the way she looked at him, as if he were a stranger, as if she regretted ever loving him. He took a step toward her. Morella, please. She shook her head, her grip tightening around her son's hand. I don't need your words, Cashin. I need proof. And right now, all I have is this. She gestured toward the phone. So tell me, what exactly am I supposed to believe? He reached for her, but she stepped back. Don't. His chest ached in a way it never had before. Morella, But she was already turning away, picking up her suitcase. Goodbye, Cashin. He watched her walk out the door, the sound of her son's small steps following hers. And for the first time in his life, Cashin Edward felt powerless. Hours passed. Cashin barely remembered how he ended up in his office, his fingers gripping the edges of his desk. The recording played in his mind on an endless loop, every word a knife to the gut. She was gone. He had lost her. The one person who had made him feel human. The woman who had never cared about his wealth, who had fought with him, laughed with him, loved him in a way no one else ever had. And now, she had left because of words he had spoken when his pride had been at stake. His stomach twisted. Cashin didn't move until his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a news notification. His body went cold as he read the headline. Billionaire Cashin Edward exposed. The recording that shattered his marriage. A video was attached. He clicked on it, his pulse hammering as the familiar conversation played. The whole world had heard it now. His betrayal wasn't just hers anymore. It was public. Every news channel was talking about it. The internet was ripping him apart. He scrolled through the comments. Disgusting. She deserves better. So he used her? What a piece of trash. She should take him for everything he has. Poor woman. Cashin dropped the phone onto his desk, running a hand through his hair. Morella. She was out there alone in the middle of this storm, and he had put her there. This wasn't just about proving himself to her anymore. This was about protecting her. The press conference was packed. Reporters filled the space, cameras flashing, microphones waiting for his statement. Cashin stood at the podium, his hands gripping the sides. He had given countless speeches in his life. Business deals, shareholder meetings, corporate takeovers. None of them had ever mattered. Not like this. He took a slow breath. Then he looked up straight into the cameras and spoke. The recording you all heard is real. His voice was steady, but inside he was anything but. I said those words, and I won't make excuses for them. The room was silent. He swallowed, his grip tightening. But you need to know the truth. Morella stood near the back, arms crossed, her eyes puffy from crying. His chest ached at the sight of her. Cashin turned back to the cameras. I was ashamed. His voice was rougher now. Not of her. Never of her. His fingers curled into fists. I was ashamed of myself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He exhaled slowly. I let my pride dictate my actions. When my so-called friends mocked me for falling in love with a waitress, I let their words get to me. I said things I didn't mean to protect my ego. And in doing so, I hurt the only person who has ever truly mattered to me. The room was dead silent now. Cashin let out a sharp breath. I love Morella Cruz. The words were raw, stripped of all the arrogance, all the detachment he had once used as armor. And I will spend the rest of my life proving it. Morella's gaze didn't waver. He didn't expect forgiveness. Not yet. But as long as she was here, as long as she was listening, he still had a chance. The videos went viral. This billionaire had a heart. A week later, Morella stood outside the cafe, her arms crossed as she watched Cashin struggle with the small bike. Her son, Mateo, sat on the seat, his tiny hands gripping the handlebars while Cashin crouched next to him, adjusting the training wheels with more focus than she'd ever seen him give to a board meeting. Hold still, kid, Cashin muttered. If this thing isn't tight enough, you'll tip over the second you move. Mateo huffed. I'm not a kid. I'm 6. Morella pressed her lips together, hiding a smile. Cashin sat back on his heels, inspecting his work. 6, huh? That's practically ancient. He patted the bike frame and stood, stretching his arms. All right, give it a try. Mateo hesitated, looking between his mother and Cashin. Morella raised an eyebrow. Go on, Matty. The boy took a deep breath, placed his feet on the pedals, and pushed forward. Cashin jogged beside him, keeping a firm hold on the back of the seat, steadying him. Morella should have looked away, should have ignored the strange, sweet feeling creeping in her chest at the sight of them together. But she didn't. This was what Cashin had been doing for days now. Not with expensive gifts or public apologies, but with small, steady actions that spoke louder than any words. He never once demanded forgiveness. He showed up. He waited. He listened. And despite everything, she found herself lowering her guard, piece by piece. One evening, Cashin showed up at her apartment with takeout, standing awkwardly at the door like a man afraid of being turned away. I didn't know if you cooked already. He lifted the bag slightly. Thought I'd take my chances. Morella folded her arms. You're bribing me with food now? He smirked, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. You always liked Thai. Figured it was a safer bet than showing up with diamonds. She didn't answer right away. Then, with a sigh, She stepped aside. You coming in? Or are you just going to stand there? Cashin exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath, and walked inside. They ate in quiet at first, the air between them unfamiliar, not strained, but cautious. Morella picked at her noodles. You don't have to do this, you know. Cashin put his chopsticks down. Do what? Pretend to be. She hesitated. Something you're not. His eyes softened. Morella, I'm not pretending. She looked away. You say that now. He reached across the table, but stopped himself before touching her. I know I ruined everything, and I know I have no right to ask for another chance. But I want you to know this. Whether you take me back or not, I'm not going anywhere. She studied him, searching for even the slightest trace of insincerity. For the first time, she didn't find any. Days turned into weeks. Cashin kept his word. He was there for every school pickup, every scraped knee, every exhausted evening when Morella came home late and found her son fast asleep on the couch with Cashin snoring beside him. He learned how Matteo liked his sandwiches. No crust, extra peanut butter. He sat through kindergarten plays with a straight face, even when Matteo forgot his lines. Slowly, without realizing when it happened, Morella stopped waiting for him to leave. One night, she found Cashin in the kitchen, stirring a pot on the stove. The smell of garlic filled the air. You're cooking? She leaned against the counter, watching him with amusement. He lifted a brow. I am capable of feeding myself. She crossed her arms. Since when? He scoffed. Since YouTube. Morella bit back a laugh. Cashin stirred the sauce, then glanced at her. I was thinking, maybe we could go somewhere this weekend. Just the three of us. Morella hesitated. Like a trip? Just a day thing. Matteo mentioned the zoo. He shifted slightly. No pressure. Just thought he'd like it. She should have said no. She should have reminded herself that keeping a distance was safer. But Matteo had been happier these past few weeks than she had ever seen him. And maybe, just maybe, so had she. The zoo trip was a disaster in the best way. Matteo ran ahead, pointing at every animal he saw, dragging Cashin from one exhibit to the next. Cashin, billionaire businessman, former Stoneheart, spent 20 minutes arguing with a 6-year-old about whether penguins were birds or fish. By the time they got to the elephant enclosure, Matteo was exhausted, clinging to Cashin's leg as he yawned. Morella reached for him, but Cashin scooped him up before she could. I got him, he murmured. She watched as Matteo curled against Cashin's shoulder, his small hands gripping the fabric of his jacket. Cashin's hand came up instinctively, stroking the back of the boy's head. Morella's heart ached. This was real. This was theirs, and she didn't want to fight it anymore. That night, as they stood outside her apartment, Morella hesitated. Cashin shifted beside her. I should go. She swallowed hard, her fingers curling into her sleeves. Or you could stay. His head snapped toward her. She didn't look away. Matteo's already asleep. And she exhaled. I think it's time. Cashin didn't move, as if afraid she'd change her mind. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. Morella, are you sure? She nodded. I'm sure. Cashin let out a shaky breath before wrapping his arms around her, holding her tightly. This time, she didn't pull away. Months later, Cashin sat across from a judge, papers in hand. Matteo swung his legs in his chair, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Morella sat beside Cashin, fingers entwined with his. Mr. Edward, the judge said, flipping through the documents. You understand what this adoption means? Cashin tightened his grip on Morella's hand. I do. You'll be responsible for this child, as if he were your own by birth. Cashin turned to Matteo, whose wide eyes met his. I know, Cashin murmured. The judge nodded. Then, as of today, Matteo Cruz is legally Matteo Edward. Morella let out a loud exhale. Cashin leaned down, meeting Matteo's eyes. You okay with that, kid? Matteo grinned. Yeah. Can we get ice cream now? Cashin laughed, ruffling his hair. Yeah, buddy. We can get ice cream. Morella wiped at her eyes, smiling and rubbing her growing belly as she watched them. She had gone from a struggling waitress to a billionaire's wife. But more importantly, she had found the love she never thought she deserved.